You don't notice it at first. The space, the pause, the moment that used to disappear without you even knowing. It was there. Before everything happened. Inside you. All at once. A look shifted. A tone changed. A message came late. And your body answered immediately. Your chest tightened. Before your mind caught up. Your stomach dropped. Before you could name why. Your thoughts raced. To close the gap. As fast as possible. You reacted. Because reaction felt like safety. Because stillness used to feel dangerous. Because waiting felt like abandonment. Because silence felt like rejection. So you filled the space with explanation, with reassurance seeking, with emotional labor, with self-adjustment. You didn't do this because you were dramatic. You did it because your nervous system was trained to survive. Connection by staying alert, by staying ahead, by staying responsive, by staying needed. And for a long time, that strategy worked. It kept people close. It kept relationships moving. It kept conflict from exploding. But it came at a cost. You didn't know how to name. You were never resting. Inside yourself, you were monitoring, scanning, predicting, preparing. Your body lived in a constant state of readiness, ready to explain, ready to soften, ready to fix, ready to make sense of other people's shifts. And because that state felt familiar, you mistook it for intuition. You thought you were perceptive, empathic, emotionally intelligent. But beneath all of that was a nervous system that never felt fully safe. To stop reacting, then something changed. Not because someone finally behaved better, not because life became calmer, but because you did. You began to feel the cost of immediacy. You began to notice how drained you felt after every emotional spike, how tired you were of replaying conversations, how much of your energy went into responding instead of living. At first, the pause felt wrong, unnatural, like you were withholding, like you were being cold, like you were failing at being good. Your body wanted to jump in. Your mind wanted to resolve. Your heart wanted to smooth things over. But you stayed, not rigidly, not defensively. You stayed because something deeper asked you to. And in that pause, you felt fear, not fear of the other person, fear of not reacting, fear of letting the moment be unfinished, fear of discovering what would happen if you didn't manage the outcome. This is where most people go back. They mistake this fear for intuition telling them to act. But you didn't. You breathed. You waited. You allowed the sensation to move through you instead of turning it into action. And something unexpected happened. The urge softened. The urgency loosened. The story slowed down. And clarity began to emerge. Not clarity about what to say, clarity about what was real. You noticed how often your reactions had been covering for other people's inconsistency. You noticed how often you had been filling emotional gaps that weren't yours. You noticed how much you had been responding to potential loss instead of actual harm. And once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. When you stop reacting, you stop editing reality. You stop rushing to make things feel better before they show you what they are. You stop explaining yourself to people who already heard you. You stop chasing clarity from people who benefit from ambiguity. You start seeing patterns, not isolated moments, not emotional spikes. Patterns. Who follows through? Who disappears under pressure? Who meets you halfway? Who only engages when it's convenient? Reaction keeps you focused on moments. Stillness reveals behavior, and behavior is always more honest then words. As you stayed in that pause, your body began to learn something new, that you wouldn't abandon it. That discomfort wouldn't destroy you. That uncertainty was survivable. Your nervous system started to downshift, not all at once, but enough. Enough for your breath to deepen, enough for your shoulders to soften, enough for your thoughts to stop spiraling. And with that regulation came discernment. You stopped asking, "What should I say?" and started asking, "What am I noticing?" You stopped asking, "How do I fix this?" and started asking, "Why does this keep happening?" You stopped blaming yourself for emotional confusion that was never yours to carry. This is the moment clarity enters, not as judgment, not as detachment, but as grounded awareness. You realize how often you were reacting to avoid feeling unchosen, how often you were over-communicating to avoid being misunderstood, how often you were softening your needs to avoid being too much. And you feel compassion for that version of you because she wasn't weak. She was trying to keep connection without losing love. But now, you don't need to react to be worthy. You don't need to respond instantly to be secure. You don't need to manage emotions that aren't yours. You allow things to reveal themselves. You let silence speak. You let space show you who can meet you there. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. You choose responses instead of reflexes. You speak from alignment instead of anxiety. You move from truth instead of urgency. And that changes how people meet you. Some lean in, some fall away, but you don't panic because clarity has replaced fear. You understand now. That reaction was never intuition. It was survival. And survival doesn't need to run your life anymore. You can pause. You can observe. You can trust that what's meant to stay won't require you to abandon yourself. This is where power begins. Not in control, not in intensity, but in the moment. You choose to see clearly instead of react quickly. Once you stop reacting, you don't become numb. You become honest. Honest in ways you couldn't afford before. Because reaction kept you busy. Busy interpreting. Busy adjusting. Busy trying to stay connected. Stillness removes the distraction. And what remains is truth. Not dramatic truth. Quiet truth. The kind you feel before you think. You start noticing how often your body tightens around certain people. Not because you're anxious, because you're alert. You notice how some conversations leave you grounded and others leave you scattered. You notice how some people can hold space without demanding performance and others only feel safe when you are accommodating. This isn't judgment, it's awareness. And awareness changes everything because now, instead of reacting to what someone says, you're responding to how being with them actually feels. You stop explaining discomfort away. You stop telling yourself you're too sensitive. You stop intellectualizing what your body already knows. Before, you reacted to preserve connection. Now, you observe to preserve self-respect. And that shift is subtle, but irreversible. You realize how often your reactions were attempts to restore balance that you didn't disrupt. You weren't overreacting. You were overfunctioning, carrying emotional weight that wasn't evenly distributed. Once you see that, you begin to pause, not just externally, but internally. You stop rushing to make meaning. You let interactions land. You let words settle into the body. You let patterns emerge over time. And patterns are hard to argue with. You notice who only shows up when you initiate, who disappears when things require depth, who listens only to respond, who stays present, even when emotions rise. Reaction blinded you to these differences. Clarity highlights them. And at first, this can feel disorienting because clarity often arrives before acceptance. You may feel sadness for how much you overlooked. You may feel grief for how much energy you gave away trying to make things work. You may feel anger at yourself, not because you were foolish, but because you were loyal past the point of safety. This is normal. This is part of integration. When you stop reacting, you also stop numbing. You feel more, but you feel cleaner, less chaotic, less desperate, more anchored. You don't feel the need to immediately express everything. You trust that what matters will remain true, even if you don't say it right away. This is where discernment forms, not in the mind, in the body. You start noticing how your energy changes before and after interactions. You notice when you're shrinking, when you're bracing, when you're performing calm, instead of embodying it. And instead of correcting yourself, you listen. You ask, what is this response protecting me from? Often, the answer surprises you. It isn't about the present moment. It's about old dynamics, old roles, old expectations. You realize how much of your reactivity was learned, how early you learned to anticipate moods, how early you learned to manage emotional climates, how early you learned that being attuned was safer than being authentic. Reaction was adaptive. It kept you connected when connection felt conditional. But now, you're no longer living in those conditions. Your body just hasn't caught up yet. So you give it time. You don't force calm. You allow regulation. You don't shame the urge to react. You acknowledge it without obeying it. And slowly, your system learns a new truth that you don't lose love by pausing, that you don't disappear by staying quiet, that you don't become irrelevant by not overfunctioning. This is where power deepens because you stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. You stop confusing urgency with importance. You stop equating emotional labor with closeness. And in that clarity, your standards shift, not dramatically, quietly. You don't announce them. You don't explain them. You simply stop participating in dynamics that require self-betrayal. You notice how some people respond to this shift. Some will push. They'll ask, what's wrong? They'll say, you've changed. They'll sense they no longer have access to your automatic availability. And that's information, not something to react to, something to observe. Others will relax. They'll meet you in the pause. They'll appreciate the grounded presence. They won't demand immediate reassurance. They won't punish space. These are the people who were never threatened by your stillness. Reaction used to blur this distinction. Clarity sharpens it. You begin to see that mutual regulation feels different than emotional management. You no longer feel responsible for keeping things afloat. You let silence exist. You let others reveal how they handle it. And that reveals compatibility in a way conversation never could. You also begin to hear yourself more clearly, your own needs, your own limits, your own desires, not the ones you learned to prioritize, the ones that emerge when you're no longer reacting. You realize how often your yes was actually a reflex, how often your I'm fine was a regulation strategy, how often your availability came at the cost of your alignment. And now, you don't rush to answer. You check in, you feel, you choose. This doesn't make life quieter. It makes it truer. Your relationships become simpler. not because they're shallow, but because they're honest. You stop negotiating with confusion. You stop arguing with inconsistency. You stop explaining what doesn't need explaining. Clarity gives you permission to step back without stepping away from yourself, and something stabilizes inside you. You trust yourself, not because you're always calm, but because you won't abandon your awareness to keep peace. This is the real shift, not becoming unbothered, becoming anchored. You don't react because you don't need to prove. You don't rush because you're no longer afraid of what space might show you. You let things unfold, and what unfolds is always more honest than what you could have forced. Once clarity settles in, your choices begin to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, internally. You no longer choose from urgency. You no longer choose from fear of loss. You no longer choose from the need to stabilize something that was never stable. You choose from alignment, and alignment feels calm, even when the decision is hard. You notice this first in small moments. You don't reply right away, not to punish, not to withdraw, but because you're checking in. You feel your body. You notice whether your response would be a reflex or a truth. And if it's a reflex, you wait. That waiting used to feel unbearable. Now it feels respectful to yourself. You begin to say no without over explaining, not because you're closed, but because you're clear. You don't rush to justify your boundaries. You don't feel the need to soften them so they're easier to accept. You let them stand, and what stands begins to teach you. You see who honors them, who negotiates them, who ignores them, who only liked you when you were flexible. This information arrives quietly, but it lands deeply. Before, you would have reacted, you would have clarified, you would have tried to make it mutual. Now, you observe, and in observing, you reclaim power. You stop mistaking effort for compatibility. You stop mistaking history for obligation. You stop mistaking intensity for depth. You realize how much of your choosing was driven by hope. Hope that someone would change. Hope that consistency would arrive. Hope that if you explained it differently, they would finally understand. Clarity dissolves false hope, not in a cruel way, in a freeing way. You see people as they are, not as potential, not as projects, not as something you can manage, into safety. And when you see clearly, your body relaxes because it no longer has to anticipate. You no longer scan for signs. You no longer read between lines. You no longer live in emotional suspense. You either feel steady or you don't, and you trust that. Walking away changes too. Before, walking away felt like failure, like abandonment, like giving up, because you were leaving from reaction, from overwhelm, from emotional exhaustion. Now, walking away feels clean, not easy, but clean. There's no inner argument, no spiraling doubt, no second guessing. Once the decision is made, because you didn't decide in a moment of intensity, you decided after observation, after regulation, after clarity. You gave yourself time to see what was actually happening. And when you leave now, you're not running. You're choosing yourself without needing the other person to understand. This is where boundaries become embodied. They're not rules you recite, they're limits your body holds. You don't have to announce them, your energy does. You stop chasing closure. You realize closure doesn't come from conversations, it comes from congruence, from your inner experience, matching your outer choices. You stop needing people to agree with your reality. You trust your own perception. That trust is stabilizing. You don't feel compelled to convince. You don't feel tempted to return just to ease discomfort. You let discomfort exist because you know it will pass, and it does. What replaces it is something steadier, self-respect, not the rigid kind, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need applause. You also begin to choose who you lean toward, not who excites your nervous system, who steadies it, not who mirrors old patterns, who feels emotionally available without intensity. This can feel unfamiliar at first. Calm used to feel boring because chaos felt like connection. But now, calm feels safe, and safety allows intimacy to deepen. You notice how you show up differently. You listen more. You perform less. You speak from presence, not pressure. You let conversations breathe. You let silence be neutral. You don't rush to fill it with reassurance or humor. You trust the space, and people who are secure feel comfortable there. People who relied on your reactivity don't. Again, this isn't something you manage. It happens naturally. Clarity filters your world without force. You stop making exceptions for emotional unavailability. You stop justifying mixed signals. You stop bargaining with your needs. You begin to recognize how much energy was freed when you stopped reacting. That energy returns to you. You sleep better. You think more clearly. You feel more grounded in your daily life. You're no longer living inside unresolved emotional loops. And that groundedness changes how you move. You don't seek validation. You don't fear being misunderstood. You don't need constant reassurance that you're okay because you are. Not perfect, but aligned. This is what clarity gives you: the ability to choose without panic, to leave without collapse, to stay without shrinking, and most importantly, to trust yourself, even when no one else is validating the choice. That trust becomes your anchor. What changes most when you stop reacting isn't the world around you, it's the relationship you have with yourself. You stop abandoning your body to manage situations. You stop overriding signals to maintain harmony. You stop confusing peace with silence. And in that shift, something settles. You no longer feel the need to prove your clarity. You don't argue with what you see. You don't defend what you feel. You don't rush to be understood, because understanding yourself is enough. Clarity becomes a way of moving. You pause naturally, not as a technique, as a reflex of safety. Your body no longer needs to react to be heard. It trusts. You'll listen. You notice how often reactivity was a form of self-protection, a way to regain control, a way to restore equilibrium. Now, control isn't necessary. Presence is. You allow moments to unfold without interference. You let discomfort exist without assigning meaning. You let people be who they are without trying to adjust the outcome. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you precise. You act when action is aligned. You speak when words are clean. You leave when staying would cost you. And you stay when it feels nourishing. There's no inner chaos around these choices, just quiet certainty. You trust the timing of your responses. You trust the information your body gives you. You trust that clarity doesn't need urgency. You also stop taking responsibility for emotional reactions that aren't yours. You don't absorb moods. You don't preempt conflict. You don't overfunction to prevent discomfort. You let others experience the consequences of their own patterns. And this is where real boundaries live, not an explanation. Inconsistency. You're calm becomes a mirror. Some will feel soothed by it. Others will feel unsettled. Neither is your responsibility. You don't adjust to manage reactions. You remain grounded, present, clear. You realize how much strength exists in not reacting, in letting moments pass without chasing resolution, in trusting that what matters will reveal itself without force. This is emotional maturity, not control, not suppression, but discernment. You no longer live inside every emotion. You experience them without being governed by them. And that freedom is subtle but profound. You stop reliving the past in real time. You stop projecting old dynamics onto new situations. You stop asking for reassurance your body already holds. You see clearly because you are no longer looking through fear. You are looking through presence. This is the clarity that can't be taken from you because it doesn't depend on outcomes. It depends on alignment. And once you've felt it, you don't unlearn it. You don't go back to reacting, to be chosen. You don't return to chaos, to feel alive. You choose steadiness. You choose truth. You choose yourself without needing permission. And if this feels familiar, it's because something in you has already shifted. You don't need to rush it. You don't need to explain it. Just stay with it. Clarity deepens the more you honor it.